That's my grandma's house!
The wrecking ball crashed through the front wall. Crash! Glass exploded, wood splintered, 60 years of family memories reduced to rubble in seconds. The acrid smell of pulverized drywall mixed with diesel fumes. HOA. President Delilah Ashworth stood on my lawn in her designer blazer, actually clapping like she was at a fireworks show.
Should have paid your $127 dues, Rex.
She shouted over the roaring machinery. $127. That's what this power-drunk real estate vulture thought my grandmother's legacy was worth. But as I watched my family home crumble into dust, Delilah made the biggest mistake of her miserable life. She had no idea who she'd just declared war on, or the federal resources I had at my disposal to destroy her completely. The taste of revenge was already sweeter than her fake victory smile. What would you do if psycho neighbors demolished your house over loose change? Where are you watching from? Drop your HOA nightmare below. My name is Rex Caldwell, and 3 weeks ago I thought the worst part of inheriting my grandmother's house would be deciding what to do with her porcelain cat collection. Boy, was I spectacularly wrong about that. What's left of Grandma Rosalie's 1962 ranch house sits on Maple Street in Willowbrook Estates, Colorado, one of those picture-perfect neighborhoods where every lawn looks professionally manicured, and the HOA president has more power than most small-town mayors. Half the front wall is gone, the roof has a gaping hole covered by blue tarps, and my living situation now includes the constant sound of plastic sheeting flapping in the wind. But I'm still here, still living in the back half of what used to be my childhood sanctuary. I'm 52, been a federal building inspector for 15 years, though I've been keeping that detail to myself lately. After losing my wife Sarah to cancer 2 years ago, I needed a fresh start, and renovating Grandma's place seemed like the perfect retirement project. Sarah always said every house should be a home, not just an investment. That philosophy is being tested daily by the smell of water damage and exposed insulation that now defines my living space. The woman responsible for this disaster is Delilah Ashworth. Picture a real estate magazine cover model who sold her soul for a clipboard and unlimited HOA authority. Blonde highlights sharp enough to cut glass, power suits in aggressive pastels, and a smile that could freeze hell. She runs Willowbrook Estates like her personal kingdom, with her husband Marcus conveniently sitting on the city council. The destruction started with a simple letter claiming I owed $127 in delinquent HOA dues. When I called to clarify, Delilah's voice had that syrupy sweet tone that makes your skin crawl, like artificial vanilla mixed with bureaucratic poison. "Oh, Rex, honey," she purred. "I'm afraid those dues have accumulated penalties. With late fees and administrative costs, you now owe $2,847. $2,800 for what started as pocket change." "I'd like documentation of those fees," I said, keeping my voice level while sitting in my water-damaged kitchen, rainwater occasionally dripping through the plastic sheeting above. "Of course, sweetie, I'll get right on that." But every callback brought new excuses. Computer problems, files in storage, the accountant had food poisoning. Classic bureaucratic runaround, except this bureaucrat had access to heavy machinery. Here's where things got interesting. Delilah kept probing about my work. "What kind of job takes you out of town so much, Rex?" she'd ask, her voice getting tighter when I mentioned government work. Looking back, she was mapping my travel schedule, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came while I was in Denver on federal business. The emergency board meeting that authorized demolition happened at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, exactly when Delilah knew I'd be trapped in mandatory meetings 3 hours away. The vote was unanimous, 4-0, with one member absent. Guess who? According to the meeting minutes I found scattered in my damaged mailbox, my house posed immediate structural threats to community safety and required emergency remediation through partial demolition. Emergency remediation. That's HOA, speak for, we're stealing your house one wall at a time. Now I'm living like a refugee in my own family home, hosting phone calls with insurance adjusters while the wind whistles through holes where my front door used to be. The musty smell of water damage has become my new morning coffee aroma, mixed with the constant reminder that someone with a clipboard decided my grandmother's 60-year legacy was worth less than a car payment. But here's what Delilah doesn't know about Rex Caldwell. I've spent 15 years investigating federal building violations, tracking down corrupt contractors, and building cases against people who think they're above the law. I know how to follow paper trails, document evidence, and most importantly, I understand that the best revenge is always served through proper legal channels. Every morning, I wake up in my damaged bedroom, step over debris that used to be my childhood memories, and remember Sarah's advice. Never let bullies win, Rex. Make them face consequences for their actions. Time to find out exactly what legal consequences look like when you demolish a federal employee's house over fake fees. Living in a half-demolished house gives you a unique perspective on HOA overreach. Every morning I wake up to the sound of plastic tarps flapping where my roof used to be, a constant reminder that someone with a laminated badge thinks they own my life. 2 days after the emergency demolition, Delilah showed up with a clipboard thick enough to choke a federal prosecutor and that same plastic smile that probably took years of practice to perfect. "Rex, honey," she chirped, standing in what remained of my front yard. "I hope you understand this was all necessary for community safety. Now about those outstanding dues." The outstanding dues had somehow multiplied like a financial virus. The original $2,847 had magically transformed into $8,450, including emergency demolition costs, debris removal fees, and my personal favorite, community disruption penalties. I invited her into my water-damaged living room, where we sat surrounded by the smell of mold and her overpowering perfume, something floral that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. "Delilah, I'd like to see the municipal permits for your demolition work," I said, pulling out a notepad that made her fidget like a kid caught cheating on a test. "Well, that's really more of a community safety matter," she stammered. "The HOA board has full authority over emergency situations." Mini twist. That's when I knew she was lying. 15 years of federal building inspection had taught me that nobody, not even HOAs, can demolish structures without proper municipal permits. Emergency or not, there's always paperwork. I spent the next day at the county offices, wading through building permit records while breathing the musty smell of decades-old bureaucracy. What I found was beautiful in its simplicity. No permits, no municipal approvals, no emergency authorizations, nothing. Delilah had ordered the demolition of my house with about as much legal authority as a mall security guard. But here's where it got really interesting. The demolition company listed on her bogus work order was Ashworth Construction Services. A quick business license search revealed the owner, Marcus Ashworth, her husband. This wasn't about HOA dues anymore. This was about stealing valuable corner properties using fake emergencies and family-owned demolition companies. My counterattack started with an emergency injunction, something I could file as a property owner for about $150 and typically get within 24 hours. The legal argument was simple. No permits, no authority, no legal demolition. I walked into Jefferson County Courthouse the next morning carrying a briefcase full of evidence and wearing my most serious federal employee expression. The clerk's eyebrows shot up when she read Federal Building Inspector versus Willowbrook HOA. But she processed the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd seen property disputes turn ugly before. The injunction stopped any further demolition immediately, but more importantly, it forced Delilah to reveal her hand. Within hours, I received a panicked call from her lawyer. Apparently, the HOA was reviewing their emergency procedures and wanted to resolve this matter amicably. Translation: "We screwed up royally and need you to go away before anyone notices." While they scrambled to cover their tracks, I planted the first seed of their eventual destruction. An anonymous tip to Channel 7's investigative team: you might want to look into some questionable demolition practices in Willowbrook Estates. Could be a good story about HOA overreach. Nothing gets reporters excited like wealthy neighborhoods with suspicious building practices. That evening, I sat in my damaged kitchen drinking coffee from a chipped mug, watching Delilah drive by for the 4th time in 2 hours. She'd slow down, crane her neck to stare at my partially destroyed house like she couldn't believe it was still partially standing, then speed off in her white BMW. The woman was so rattled she forgot to wave at the neighbors, a cardinal sin in suburban political theater. I raised my mug in a little salute as she passed. The sound of gravel crunching under her retreating tires mixed with the flapping of tarps above my head, creating this weird symphony of damage and determination. Round 1 to the guy living in the construction zone. Delilah's response to my injunction came with the subtlety of a brick through a stained glass window, if that brick was made of bureaucratic harassment and wrapped in fake legal authority. My damaged mailbox started overflowing with violation notices that would have impressed the IRS. Unauthorized structural modifications because half my roof was missing. Unsightly property conditions, due to the debris pile in my yard. Failure to maintain community standards, since my blue tarps weren't the approved beige color. Each violation carried a $500 daily fine that accumulated faster than interest on a payday loan. The really creative touch was claiming my temporary living situation violated neighborhood residential occupancy standards. Apparently, living in a house that the HOA had partially demolished was now grounds for additional penalties. I was being fined for the consequences of their own illegal actions. While sorting through this paperwork avalanche in my water-damaged living room, breathing air that permanently smelled like wet drywall and bureaucratic malice, I started connecting dots that painted a picture uglier than my current home situation. Property records research had become my new hobby, and I was getting disturbingly good at it. 3 other families in Willowbrook had faced similar emergency situations over the past 5 years, and the pattern was identical. Manufactured violations, escalating fees, desperate families selling below market value to escape the legal nightmare. Mrs. Henderson, the 78-year-old widow on Oak Street, got hit with $15,000 in aesthetic violations because her late husband's garden gnomes allegedly disrupted the community visual harmony. She sold for 40% below market value and moved to assisted living. The Martinez family faced cultural compatibility concerns when their daughter's quinceañera decorations were deemed inconsistent with neighborhood character. Discrimination wrapped in HOA bureaucracy with a pink ribbon on top. Mr. Kowalski's structural integrity violations forced him into foreclosure when he couldn't afford both legal fees and the fabricated fines. Mini twist. Every single property had been purchased by Mountain View Properties LLC, which traced back to Marcus Ashworth operating under more shell companies than a Russian oligarch. This wasn't random harassment, it was systematic property theft using fake authority and family-owned businesses. My coalition building started with Mrs. Henderson at Sunset Manor, where the smell of industrial floor cleaner couldn't quite mask the institutional despair. When I spread my evidence across the card table in the visiting room, her cloudy eyes cleared like morning fog lifting off mountains. "You mean they had no right to do any of it?" she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Mrs. Henderson, we're not just fighting back, we're getting your house back and sending these criminals to jail." The Martinez family was running a small auto repair shop across town, working 16-hour days to rebuild what Delilah's fake authority had destroyed. Their shop smelled like honest work, motor oil, metal, and determination. When I explained that their cultural violations were actually federal civil rights violations, Mr. Martinez's calloused hands started shaking with barely contained fury. "She destroyed my daughter's celebration because we're Mexican?" he asked, his accent thick with emotion. "She destroyed your family's dreams because she's a criminal," I corrected, "and we're going to prove it." Mr. Kowalski was living in his nephew's basement, surrounded by boxes representing a lifetime of savings that had disappeared into Ashworth family accounts. The musty smell of water damage and broken dreams hung in that basement like a funeral shroud. I started using federal database access that most people don't even know exists, mapping out the entire family operation. Todd Ashworth, brother, owned the landscaping company getting all the emergency beautification contracts. Michelle Carter, cousin, ran the property management firm handling foreclosed homes. Janet Rowe, sister-in-law, worked as the appraiser who consistently undervalued properties before the family swooped in. It was organized crime with better hair products and HOA bylaws. Meanwhile, I began recording every conversation with Delilah, Colorado's one-party consent law being one of those legal details you pick up investigating federal cases. Her voice got shriller with each call, especially when I'd casually mention terms like federal racketeering or interstate fraud. "You can't intimidate me with government talk, Rex," she'd screech. "I'm just making conversation about my work, Delilah. Did you know that targeting federal employees can trigger additional charges?" The line would go dead every time. That week, Channel 7's investigative team started sniffing around my anonymous tips. I made sure they got some interesting photos of HOA funds being used to install professional landscaping at Delilah's personal residence. The sound of her panicked voice echoing across the neighborhood as she screamed at the news crew was better than any symphony ever composed. Week 3 of living in my partially demolished house brought Delilah's desperation to new heights, the kind of frantic moves that separate smart criminals from the ones who end up as case studies in federal training manuals. The escalation started with intimidation tactics that would have been obvious to a moderately intelligent golden retriever. Emergency utility work crews started showing up at my property, blocking my driveway with trucks that had more orange cones than a construction convention, and workers who seemed more interested in staring at my house than actually working. The foreman, a sweaty guy with tobacco-stained teeth, would apologize with all the sincerity of a used car salesman. "Sorry about the inconvenience, buddy. This emergency repair could take weeks." The timing was surgical. These emergencies always happened exactly when I needed to leave for federal assignments, forcing me to climb over equipment and explain to my supervisor why I looked like I'd been crawling through a construction zone. Meanwhile, anonymous complaints about my unstable behavior started flooding my federal office like spam emails from a broken bot. According to these creative masterpieces, I was mentally deteriorating, obsessed with frivolous property disputes, and displaying concerning fixation on female community leaders. One particularly inspired report claimed I'd threatened to weaponize federal building codes against innocent families. When my supervisor called, she was actually laughing. "Rex, these complaints read like bad fiction. Either you've had a complete psychotic break or someone really wants you discredited." "What gave it away?" I asked, watching fake utility workers take their 5th cigarette break while allegedly fixing an emergency water pressure issue. Well, the one claiming you threatened someone with federal demolition protocols was a nice touch, she chuckled. That's not even a real thing. But here's where Delilah made her biggest tactical error. She started spreading whispered rumors about my inappropriate conduct toward female neighbors. Nothing specific enough to constitute defamation, but carefully crafted innuendos designed to destroy my reputation through suburban gossip networks. The problem with that brilliant strategy was that I'd been building genuine relationships with those same neighbors while living in my damaged house. Several came forward to warn me about Delilah's manipulation campaign. She cornered me at the mailbox yesterday, my neighbor Carol reported while standing in my water-damaged living room, surveying the blue tarps with obvious sympathy. Kept asking if you'd made me feel unsafe or uncomfortable. When I said you'd been nothing but respectful, she got really pushy about finding incidents to report. Mini twist. That's when I realized Delilah was desperately trying to manufacture a sexual harassment case to discredit me before I could expose her criminal operation. But my surveillance system had captured her coaching potential witnesses to embellish interactions or create fictional incidents. The game changer came when my supervisor called with news that transformed my local property dispute into something much bigger. Rex, remember those harassment complaints against you? We've been tracking similar reports targeting federal employees in 17 states. Same pattern. Local HOAs manufacturing violations against government workers, coordinated intimidation, systematic attempts to force federal employees out of specific neighborhoods. The pieces clicked together like a federal investigation falling into place. This wasn't just about stealing houses. It was about keeping government oversight away from communities where local officials were running illegal operations. Congratulations, she continued. You just became our primary witness in a multi-state investigation into systematic harassment of federal employees. Hope you like paperwork. I started expanding my investigation using federal resources that make Google look like a children's toy. Mrs. Henderson's late husband? Retired DEA agent. The Martinez family's patriarch? Border Patrol supervisor. Mr. Kowalski? 20-year EPA enforcement veteran. Delilah wasn't randomly targeting vulnerable residents. She was systematically eliminating families with federal law enforcement connections. Meanwhile, I cultivated Tommy Kowalski, the neighborhood handyman who'd been invisible to these suburban criminals for years. People like Delilah never noticed the help, which meant Tommy had front row seats to their planning sessions. She's been eyeing your corner lot for 3 years, Tommy whispered over coffee at Murphy's Diner, his weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had seen better decades. Heard her telling Marcus it's perfect for commercial development, just needed to get rid of the stubborn federal guy first. Perfect. Now I had motive, method, and an inside witness who'd watched their conspiracy unfold in real time. That evening, I made sure Channel 7 got photos documenting how HOA funds had somehow paid for a new swimming pool at Delilah's personal residence. The sound of her voice shrieking at reporters from her professionally landscaped backyard was like music from Heaven's Greatest Hits collection. When Marcus pulled into their driveway and saw the cameras, his face went through more color changes than a mood ring having an identity crisis. Federal resources were now officially focused on Willowbrook Estates, and these amateur criminals had just discovered what happens when you declare war on the wrong government employee. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon while I was replacing water-damaged drywall in what used to be my living room, surrounded by the constant smell of mold and the sound of plastic tarps flapping like surrender flags. Delilah showed up unannounced with her usual entourage, Marcus, 2 board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and a guy with a clipboard who was probably supposed to intimidate me with his official-looking paperwork. She marched through the gap where my front wall used to be like she owned the place, which, according to her twisted logic, she probably thought she did. Rex, she announced, her voice echoing off what remained of my walls. This little tantrum of yours ends today. You're going to pay the $47,850 in accumulated fines and assessments, or we're finishing what we started with this demolition. $47,000. The number had grown like a tumor fed on pure bureaucratic malice. That's quite an increase from the original $127, I said calmly, not looking up from my repair work. Actions have consequences, she snapped, her plastic composure finally cracking around the edges. You should have just paid your dues like a normal resident instead of making this difficult for everyone. The small crowd of neighbors had gathered outside. Nothing draws suburban attention faster than an HOA confrontation in broad daylight. Delilah was clearly performing for an audience confident in her authority and probably expecting me to fold under public pressure. That's when I set down my tools, wiped the drywall dust off my hands, and slowly reached into my shirt pocket. You know what, Delilah? You're absolutely right. Actions do have consequences. I pulled out my federal building inspector credentials and held them up where everyone could see. the official badge catching afternoon sunlight like a spotlight. My name is Rex Caldwell, and I'm a federal building inspector with the General Services Administration. For the past month, you've been harassing, threatening, and illegally demolishing the property of a federal law enforcement officer. The effect was instantaneous and beautiful. Delilah's face went white so fast I thought she might need medical attention. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water, no sound emerging except a faint strangling noise. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered onto my debris-covered floor. Marcus took an involuntary step backward, his confident swagger evaporating like morning mist. The board members looked like they'd just realized they were standing in a courtroom instead of someone's damaged living room. But the most satisfying part was watching the arrogance drain out of Delilah's eyes and get replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "Federal inspector?" she finally managed to whisper. 15 years investigating construction fraud, building code violations, and corrupt contractors, I continued, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd just revealed their trump card. Every illegal demolition order you've signed, every fraudulent fine you've collected, every violation you've manufactured, I've been documenting all of it with federal precision. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Even the neighbors had gone quiet, sensing they were witnessing something that would become neighborhood legend. "This is impossible," Delilah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said you worked for the government." "I do work for the government. I hunt down people exactly like you." That's when Marcus tried to salvage the situation with all the intelligence of a goldfish attempting astrophysics. "Now wait just a minute," he blustered, stepping forward with his chest puffed out. "Federal employee or not, you still owe legitimate HOA dues and assessments." "Marcus," I interrupted, pulling out my phone and scrolling to a specific photo. "Would you like to explain why your demolition company submitted bills for emergency work that was never authorized by municipal permits?" His face went through the same color-draining process as his wife's, like someone had pulled the plug on their confidence and watched it swirl down the drain. The HOA board, emergency powers," he babbled, but the words came out like alphabet soup from a broken can. "The HOA has no emergency powers," I said. "In fact, the HOA has no powers at all. But we'll get to that." I looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, my neighbors who'd been watching this suburban soap opera unfold for weeks. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been living under the authority of a criminal organization that's been stealing your money and destroying your property for years." Delilah made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You can't prove any of this. We have board authority, legal precedent." "Delilah," I said, putting my credentials back in my pocket with deliberate slowness, "I've been building a federal case against your operation for 3 weeks. Mail fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, civil rights violations, and my personal favorite, targeting federal employees with criminal harassment." The sound of her breath catching was audible even over the flapping tarps. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to leave my property immediately. You're going to stop collecting illegal fines. And you're going to pray that federal prosecutors are feeling merciful when they review the evidence I've compiled." The retreat was more beautiful than any parade I'd ever seen. Delilah stumbled backward through the gap in my wall, Marcus trailing behind her like a deflated balloon, the board members scattering like cockroaches when someone turns on the lights. As they fled to their cars, I heard one neighbor whisper to another, "Did you know Rex was federal law enforcement?" The answer floated back on the afternoon breeze. I bet Delilah wishes she'd asked that question a month ago. Standing in my damaged living room, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes and the smell of their desperation, I finally understood what complete victory felt like. Delilah Ashworth had just declared war on the federal government, and she was about to lose spectacularly. The aftermath of revealing my federal credentials was like watching a controlled demolition in reverse. Instead of bringing down a building, I was systematically constructing the framework for Delilah's complete destruction. Word traveled through Willowbrook Estates faster than gossip at a church potluck. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with calls from neighbors who suddenly remembered concerning incidents they'd witnessed but never reported. Amazing how federal authority makes people's memories significantly clearer. My damaged house became mission control for what I started calling Operation Suburban Justice. The irony wasn't lost on me. Planning the takedown of corrupt HOA officials from a living room they'd partially demolished was poetic justice at its finest. The surveillance upgrade was pure federal investigator satisfaction. I installed additional cameras throughout my property, the kind that record in 4K and automatically upload to cloud storage that even sophisticated hackers would admire. The sweet smell of new electronics mixed with my constant aroma of water damage created this intoxicating cocktail of technology and determination. Every camera was positioned to catch violations of my property rights, every microphone calibrated to pick up conversations that would become evidence in federal court. If Delilah's crew wanted to continue their harassment campaign, they'd be performing for an audience of prosecutors. But the real genius was in my expanded documentation strategy. I'd learned during federal investigations that small violations often expose larger crimes, like pulling a thread that unravels an entire conspiracy. I started a modest herb garden that was absolutely, perfectly, magnificently legal, positioned exactly within property lines with surveyor-quality precision. I knew it would drive Delilah's control freak instincts completely insane. The woman probably counted individual grass blades in her sleep. My coalition of victims had grown from 3 families to 12, each bringing evidence of systematic abuse that painted a picture of organized crime disguised as suburban governance. We met in my water-damaged living room, the constant smell of mold serving as a reminder of what these criminals were capable of. Mrs. Henderson brought her late husband's DEA files, which included notes about suspicious activities in Willowbrook that he'd never had time to investigate. The Martinez family provided documentation of discriminatory enforcement that would make civil rights prosecutors break out in happy tears. Mr. Kowalski contributed financial records showing how shell companies had systematically undervalued properties before the Ashworth family swooped in. "Here's what we're dealing with," I said, spreading evidence across my salvaged coffee table like we were planning a military operation. "This isn't just HOA abuse. It's a criminal enterprise that's been targeting federal families to avoid government oversight." The technical education became my favorite part of coalition building. I taught everyone how to use smartphone apps that create court-admissible documentation. Simple knowledge like time-stamping everything, using GPS coordinates, and uploading to cloud storage immediately, skills that cost nothing but can document evidence that destroys criminal operations. We practiced using county property records websites to trace ownership patterns. Most people don't realize that searching county name plus property records can expose shell company networks that reveal systematic fraud. The searches cost about $5 each, but finding proof that the same family owns the HOA, the demolition company, the landscaping service, and the property management firm, absolutely priceless. I showed them how to file real estate board complaints for $25, paperwork that can end careers when the target has been operating without legal authority. We mapped out the process for requesting public records that expose patterns of discrimination across multiple jurisdictions. Meanwhile, I coordinated with federal colleagues who were practically salivating over our evidence collection. The postal inspector was building mail fraud charges that would make defense attorneys weep. My supervisor had connected our case to similar schemes in 19 states, creating a federal conspiracy charge with serious prison time attached. Jenny Martinez from Channel 7 was planning media coverage that would turn Delilah's downfall into must-see television. We'd identified the perfect venue, Thursday's special HOA meeting that Delilah had called to address community concerns about federal interference. The woman was literally planning her own public execution and sending out invitations. But the crown jewel of my planning was ensuring maximum opportunity for fresh crimes. I needed Delilah to commit violations in front of witnesses, on camera, with federal agents documenting every illegal action. I'd arranged for federal postal inspectors, state investigators, county prosecutors, and television cameras to attend what Delilah thought would be her opportunity to reassert control over the neighborhood. She had absolutely no idea she was walking into a federal law enforcement convention disguised as community theater. The beauty of my situation was that Delilah's desperation was making her increasingly reckless. Every day brought new violations of my rights that added charges to the growing federal case. Her attempts to intimidate a federal officer were creating evidence that prosecutors would use to seek maximum sentences. That Wednesday evening, I sat in my partially destroyed kitchen, surrounded by the smell of water damage and the sound of success. My phone buzzed constantly with confirmations from investigators, reporters, and prosecutors who would attend tomorrow's meeting. The taste of approaching justice mixed with the bitter coffee I was drinking from a chipped mug, creating this perfect cocktail of anticipation and satisfaction. Tomorrow night, Delilah Ashworth would learn what happens when suburban criminals declare war on federal law enforcement. The sound of my evidence printer working overtime was like a symphony warming up for the performance of a lifetime. Wednesday morning brought Delilah's final desperate gambit, the kind of move that separates amateur criminals from the ones smart enough to know when they're beaten. She arrived at my partially demolished house with what could only be described as a surrender disguised as an ultimatum. The envelope she carried was thick enough to paper a small room, and her smile looked like it had been assembled from spare parts of previous fake expressions. "Rex," she said, standing in the gap where my front door used to be, "I think we've all gotten a little carried away here. Time for reasonable adults to find reasonable solutions." The final settlement offer was comedy gold wrapped in legal letterhead, complete waiver of all fines and assessments in exchange for selling my property to a community-preferred buyer at fair market value, which, according to their appraisal, was 45% below actual market price due to structural damage and community disruption factors. But basically, stop investigating our crimes, and we'll only steal half your house instead of all of it. "That's very generous," I said, keeping my voice level while my hidden cameras captured every word of this attempted extortion. "But I think I'll pass." Her reconstructed smile developed stress fractures. "Rex, honey, you're making this so much more complicated than it needs to be. Federal employee or not, some battles just aren't worth fighting." "You're probably right," I agreed. "Fortunately, this isn't one of those battles." When bribery failed spectacularly, Delilah escalated to sabotage with all the subtlety of a toddler having a meltdown in public. That afternoon, my remaining water service mysteriously failed when someone took a shovel to my supply line, flooding what was left of my basement and creating damage that smelled like a swamp mixed with suburban desperation. The city utility worker was genuinely confused. 23 years on the job, never seen anything like this," he muttered, standing in ankle-deep water that reflected the blue tarps overhead. "Someone deliberately attacked your main line with heavy equipment. Who does something that crazy?" I knew exactly who, especially after reviewing my surveillance footage and discovering Academy Award-worthy performance art. Delilah's son Trevor, attacking my water line at 2:30 a.m. with a trenching shovel like some kind of suburbanite saboteur having a mental breakdown. The kid was either monumentally stupid or catastrophically overconfident that his family's local connections would protect him from federal video evidence. He was about to learn that federal prosecutors don't care much about city council friendships. While emergency plumbers worked overtime and industrial fans created a sound environment like a small airport, the character assassination campaign reached new levels of desperate creativity. Anonymous federal HR complaints painted me as everything from a mentally unstable government employee to a dangerous domestic terrorist conducting surveillance operations against law-abiding community leaders. The reports were so ridiculously over the top that my supervisor started reading them during our calls for entertainment value. "This one claims you've been photographing children's bicycles in preparation for unknown criminal activities," she laughed. "I mean, seriously? That's the best they could come up with?" "To be fair," I said, watching water damage specialists document Trevor's amateur demolition work, "I have been photographing a lot of evidence lately." But Delilah's masterpiece of stupidity was launching a neighborhood whisper campaign about my inappropriate behavior toward female residents. Nothing specific enough to constitute actual defamation, but carefully crafted rumors designed to destroy my credibility through suburban gossip networks. The fatal flaw in that brilliant strategy was that I'd spent weeks building genuine relationships with those same neighbors while living in my damaged house. Several came forward to warn me about Delilah's manipulation attempts. "She cornered me at the grocery store," my neighbor Sarah reported while surveying my latest flood damage. "Kept insisting you must have done something concerning that I was too embarrassed to report. When I said you'd been nothing but helpful, she got really aggressive about finding incidents to document." Mini twist. That's when I realized Delilah was trying to manufacture a sexual harassment scandal to discredit me before Thursday's meeting. But my surveillance system had captured her coaching potential witnesses to embellish interactions or create fictional incidents from whole cloth. The beautiful irony was that every attempt to discredit me only provided more evidence of witness tampering and conspiracy to file false reports, both serious federal crimes that prosecutors love because they're essentially impossible to defend. The game-changing discovery came when I realized Delilah had been monitoring my communications through Marcus's city government access. She knew about my federal investigation, my victim coalition, and my plans for tomorrow's confrontation, which explained her increasingly unhinged attempts to destroy my credibility before I could present evidence that would obliterate her criminal operation. What this amateur spy hadn't realized was that I'd been feeding her carefully crafted disinformation for the past week. Every confidential conversation she'd intercepted was designed to make her commit additional crimes while preparing for threats that existed only in my imagination. I'd discussed fictional federal raids that would never happen, imaginary witness protection protocols that didn't exist, and fabricated evidence that sent her scrambling to cover up crimes she hadn't even committed yet. By Wednesday evening, standing in my flooded basement surrounded by the humid smell of water damage and criminal desperation, I marveled at how perfectly Delilah had destroyed herself. Every illegal action she'd taken to stop my investigation had only provided more ammunition for federal prosecutors. The constant hum of industrial dehumidifiers mixed with my phone buzzing like an angry hornet as reporters, investigators, and prosecutors confirmed attendance at tomorrow's community theater performance. Delilah believed she was fighting a property dispute with one stubborn homeowner. Tomorrow, she'd discover she'd been conducting warfare against a federal law enforcement operation that had been documenting her crimes with the methodical patience of a professional hunter stalking perfect prey. The taste of approaching victory was considerably sweeter than the basement flood damage was bitter. Thursday morning dawned with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes you believe in justice, cosmic balance, and the inevitable consequences of attacking federal employees with fake authority and heavy machinery. Delilah's final gambit arrived via certified mail at 6 a.m., a document so legally toxic it practically glowed with radioactive bureaucratic malice. Final demand for payment blazed across the top in red letters that looked like they'd been written in the blood of failed HOA dictators. The financial creativity was breathtaking. My original $127 debt had metastasized into $67,325 in accumulated violations, emergency repair costs, community disruption penalties, and administrative processing fees. The itemized breakdown read like a masterclass in extortion, disguised as accounting. $25,000 for emergency waterline repair, caused by their own criminal son. $18,000 for structural remediation assessment, evaluating damage from their illegal demolition. $15,000 in community safety penalties, and over $9,000 in processing fees that would have made payday loan sharks weep with professional admiration. Payment was due within 24 hours. Or they would proceed with complete property seizure and total demolition under emergency community safety protocols. The smell of desperation was so thick you could practically taste it through the certified mail envelope. But here's where Delilah made her final, fatal mistake. She put every criminal threat in writing, sent it through federal mail, and signed her name to what amounted to a confession of extortion, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. I actually laughed reading that letter while my morning coffee steamed in the autumn air, surrounded by the ongoing symphony of industrial dehumidifiers working to repair the damage from her latest criminal tantrum. 15 years of federal investigations, and I'd never seen a suspect gift-wrap their own conviction quite so beautifully. The phone call started before the mail truck had finished its route. Delilah's voice had reached frequencies that probably violated several laws of physics and definitely violated noise ordinances. "This is your absolute final chance, Rex," she shrieked, her composure completely shattered like cheap glass in a hurricane. "Pay the assessments, or we finish demolishing your pathetic house tomorrow morning." "Delilah," I said calmly, "you do realize you're making criminal threats over federal communication lines to a federal law enforcement officer while he's recording the conversation for evidence purposes?" The silence stretched so long I thought she might have thrown her phone into traffic. You can't," she finally stammered. "Actually, I can. And I have been. For weeks." The line went dead with the sound of pure panic. By noon, the Ashworth family meltdown was visible from low Earth orbit. Marcus spent his lunch break driving past my house every 10 minutes, his face getting progressively redder each time he saw news crews setting up equipment for evening coverage. Delilah made 4 trips to City Hall, probably trying to use her husband's connections to shut down tonight's meeting or at least limit media access. Too late for damage control, sweethearts. The federal train had already left the station, and it was heading directly for their criminal operation. The afternoon brought reinforcements that would have made Delilah soil her designer blazer if she'd known what was assembling. Federal postal inspectors arrived in unmarked cars that screamed government investigation to anyone with functional brain cells. State investigators followed, along with a county prosecutor who looked like Christmas morning had arrived 6 weeks early. My coalition of victims gathered in my water-damaged living room for final preparations, the air thick with anticipation and the lingering aroma of mold from Trevor's demolition work. Mrs. Henderson clutched folders containing 60 years of meticulously organized documentation. The Martinez family brought photos of their daughter's destroyed quinceañera dreams. Mr. Kowalski carried boxes of evidence representing his stolen life's work. "Tonight we end this," I told them, feeling the weight of federal authority behind every word. "These criminals learn what happens when they target the wrong families." The taste of approaching justice was more satisfying than any meal I'd ever consumed. As sunset painted the Colorado mountains the same shade of pink as Delilah's ridiculous power suits, I put on my dress federal inspector uniform and pinned my credentials where every person in that community center would see them clearly. The metal badge felt heavier than usual, weighted with the responsibility of representing every HOA abuse victim across the country. Jenny Martinez from Channel 7 called for final confirmation. "Rex, we're going live at 8. The whole state's going to be watching this." Jenny, I said, watching Delilah's BMW circle my damaged house for the 8th time in 2 hours. I've been ready for this moment my entire career. My phone buzzed with a text from my federal supervisor. Tear them apart. The whole bureau is watching. The sound of Delilah's increasingly frantic driving patterns mixed with the evening news helicopters circling overhead, creating this surreal soundtrack of approaching justice and criminal desperation. Tonight, suburban corruption would meet federal authority in the most public way possible, and every second would be captured on live television. The Willowbrook Community Center had never hosted a federal law enforcement operation disguised as an HOA meeting. But there's a first time for everything, especially when suburban criminals bite off more than they can legally chew. By 7:45 p.m., the room was packed beyond fire code capacity, with an audience that would have made Broadway producers weep with envy. Homeowners filled every folding chair, lined the walls like spectators at a championship fight, and spilled out into the parking lot while Channel 7's live stream climbed past 800 viewers and showed no signs of slowing. Federal agents positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd with the casual precision of professionals who'd done this before. State investigators sat in the front row taking notes. County prosecutors occupied the back corner with briefcases full of warrants that were probably still warm from the printing press. Delilah entered at exactly 8 p.m. wearing a power suit so aggressively pink it could have been spotted by satellite imagery, her usual plastic smile looking like it had been assembled from broken pieces and held together with pure desperation. She carried her ceremonial clipboard like a shield and surveyed her kingdom with the confidence of someone who had absolutely no idea she was walking into federal court disguised as community theater. Marcus followed behind her, sweating through his discount suit despite the autumn chill, his eyes darting around the room like a shoplifter checking for security cameras, which, ironically, was exactly what he should have been worried about. "Good evening, everyone," Delilah chirped into the microphone, her voice echoing off walls that had never witnessed such beautiful irony. "Welcome to our special community meeting. As always, we're here to discuss maintaining our neighborhood's high standards and addressing recent disruptions." She launched into her prepared presentation about successful property management initiatives and effective enforcement protocols, completely oblivious to the federal agents documenting every word for posterity and the television cameras broadcasting her confession to viewing audiences across Colorado. "Our recent compliance actions have been particularly successful," she continued, practically glowing with pride at her own criminal accomplishments. "We've resolved several challenging property situations through our comprehensive violation assessment and remediation procedures." Translation: "We've been stealing houses from federal families using fake legal authority, and we're proud of it." The woman was literally confessing to organized crime on live television while thinking she was delivering a victory speech. Now, regarding the recent interference from certain residents who seemed to misunderstand community authority structures. That's when I stood up. The room went silent except for the hum of recording equipment and the sound of Delilah's confidence evaporating like steam from a broken radiator. I slowly walked toward the front of the room, my federal credentials visible on my uniform, every step echoing like a countdown to Judgment Day. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of 15 years investigating federal crimes. "Before Ms. Ashworth continues, there's something this community needs to know about your HOA board." I reached the microphone and looked directly at Delilah, whose face had gone white as fresh snow on mountain peaks. "My name is Rex Caldwell. I'm a federal building inspector, and for the past month I've been conducting an investigation into systematic criminal activity operating under the guise of HOA authority." The audience erupted like a courtroom drama, but the best part was watching Marcus try to edge toward the exit, only to find his path blocked by very interested federal agents who'd positioned themselves with professional precision. "Ms. Ashworth," I continued, activating the room's projection system to display evidence that would make prosecutors break into spontaneous applause, "would you like to explain to this community how you've been operating an illegal criminal enterprise for over 15 years? The first slide showed the original 1962 HOA incorporation documents, zooming in on the expiration clause that had legally dissolved their authority in 2012. These covenants expired 14 years ago. You've had no legal power to collect fines, issue violations, or demolish property since the Obama administration. The audience reaction was like watching a dam burst in real time, shocked gasps, angry shouts, and the beautiful sound of a community realizing they'd been systematically robbed by criminals with clipboards. Every fine you've collected, every family you've destroyed, every property you've stolen, all based on authority that exists only in your criminal imagination. Federal Postal Inspector Janet Torres stepped forward from the back wall, her badge catching the fluorescent lights like a beacon of justice. "Delilah Ashworth, you're under federal investigation for mail fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, civil rights violations, and systematic harassment of federal employees." State investigator Mike Chen joined her with the kind of smile that defense attorneys wake up screaming about. Mrs. Ashworth, your real estate license has been suspended, and your husband's construction permits are under criminal review. The look of absolute terror on Delilah's face was worth every night I'd slept in my water-damaged house, every threatening phone call, every illegal fine she'd tried to collect. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping in poisoned water, no sound emerging except pathetic whimpering. "This is impossible," she finally croaked. "We have authority, legal precedent, community standards." That's when I delivered the line I'd been practicing for weeks. "Delilah, you demolished my house claiming I owed $127 in HOA dues. I'm about to demolish your entire criminal organization using real federal authority. The difference is my demolition will be completely legal." The room exploded in applause that could have registered on seismic equipment. Mrs. Henderson was crying tears of vindication. The Martinez family was embracing like they'd just won the lottery. Mr. Kowalski was pumping his fist like his team had won the World Series. Jenny Martinez thrust her microphone toward Delilah for comment, but the former HOA dictator had gone completely catatonic, staring at my federal credentials like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics from a civilization she couldn't comprehend. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to escape justice, but found himself face-to-face with County Prosecutor David Wong, who was holding handcuffs and wearing the kind of expression that makes criminals consider plea bargains. The sound of justice being served in real time was more beautiful than any symphony ever composed, more satisfying than any victory ever achieved. 8 months later, I'm sitting on the front porch of my completely rebuilt house, paid for entirely by the Ashworth family's seized criminal assets, watching kids play in the new community park that replaced the illegally obtained properties. And I can honestly say that federal justice tastes even better when it's served with complete asset forfeiture and a side of criminal prosecution. The immediate reckoning came swift and merciless, like karma driving a government-issued steamroller with federal authority. Within 72 hours of our town hall showdown, Delilah's real estate license was permanently revoked. Marcus lost his city council seat and all his construction contracts, and their entire extended family found themselves under federal investigation for what prosecutors called the most systematic HOA fraud scheme in Colorado history. Federal charges included mail fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, civil rights violations, targeting federal employees, and my personal favorite, racketeering under the RICO statute. Turns out when you operate a multi-generational criminal enterprise targeting government families to avoid federal oversight, Uncle Sam takes it extremely personally. The asset forfeiture proceedings were particularly satisfying to watch. Every illegally collected fine was returned with compound interest. Every fraudulently seized property was restored to rightful owners or their estates. The Ashworth family's network of shell companies was dissolved like sugar in acid rain, their luxury lifestyle liquidated to compensate victims across 4 states. Mrs. Henderson got her house back along with $200,000 in damages that allowed her to hire full-time care and establish a college fund for her great-grandchildren. The Martinez family not only recovered their property but received enough compensation to expand their auto repair business and throw their daughter the quinceañera celebration worthy of a princess. Mr. Kowalski used his settlement to retire comfortably and establish the Federal Employee Defense Fund, a scholarship program specifically for government workers' children pursuing careers in law enforcement or public service. But the real victory was the Sarah Caldwell Foundation for HOA Abuse Victims, established with my settlement money and named after the woman who taught me that every house should be a home, not a commodity for suburban criminals to steal through fake authority. The foundation provides free legal resources, connects victims with federal investigators, and offers HOA watchdog training seminars for homeowners nationwide. We've helped over 300 families in our first year, and our website receives thousands of visits monthly from people seeking protection from out-of-control boards. Our biggest legislative success was the Willowbrook Accountability Act, requiring all HOAs to file annual compliance reports and subjecting them to state oversight with criminal penalties for violations. 5 states have adopted similar legislation, and federal lawmakers are considering national standards for HOA operations that would prevent future Delilahs from terrorizing communities. My personal healing came from transforming a property dispute into a mission protecting others from systematic abuse. I chose not to rebuild on Grandma's exact footprint. Instead, I donated that specific lot for the community park where children now play on equipment purchased with money seized from the criminals who tried to steal their families' homes. The Netflix documentary, Suburban Conspiracy, The HOA Crime Family, premiered to critical acclaim and sparked congressional hearings about HOA reform nationwide. Delilah's arrest footage became a viral sensation, which seems appropriate for someone who weaponized bureaucracy for criminal profit. Speaking of Delilah, she's currently serving 12 years in federal prison for racketeering and conspiracy, while Marcus got 8 years for civil rights violations and fraud. Their appeals were rejected faster than their bogus HOA violations, and their former mansion now houses a legal aid clinic helping low-income families fight housing discrimination. The taste of complete victory is like the perfect cup of coffee on an ideal morning. Warm, satisfying, and absolutely worth every moment of the fight that preceded it. Last week, I received a call from a homeowner in Florida whose HOA is attempting foreclosure because her grass is allegedly the wrong shade of green. I smiled, opened a fresh case file, and booked a flight to Miami. The Sarah Caldwell Foundation has important work to do. The sound of children laughing in the park where my grandmother's house once stood reminds me daily that sometimes the best memorial to someone you love is ensuring their values live on through protecting others from the predators who would destroy their dreams. If you're dealing with an out-of-control HOA targeting you with manufactured violations, excessive fines, or discriminatory enforcement, don't fight alone. Visit the Sarah Caldwell Foundation website for resources and support. We read every story and investigate cases that show patterns of systematic abuse. And if you enjoyed watching corrupt suburban tyrants get their federal comeuppance through proper legal channels, hit that subscribe button for more stories about ordinary citizens defeating systems designed to crush individual rights. Because sometimes David doesn't just beat Goliath, he sends him to federal prison where he belongs, then builds a playground on the ruins of his criminal empire.
You know what gets me about Red's situation? Dahlia had him right when she wanted him. House half demolished, living under taps. Neighbors probably thinking he would lock his wife to make over $127, and she just kept pushing. Even after he built out all the federal credentials, she couldn't help herself. Had to send that final demand letter through the mail, $67,000 or complete demolition. That's the thing about people who get drunk on a little bit of power. They start believing their own authority is real, even when it expired 14 years ago. I mean, Rex could have gotten angry, could have started yelling about his rights, making threats and all that. Instead, he just documented everything, let them dig their own hole deeper while he built his case. Makes you wonder how many other HOAs out there are running on expired paperwork and hoping nobody bothers to check the county records. Have you ever had to deal with someone in your neighborhood who seems to think the rules is only applied to everyone else? I'm curious what that looks like where you live. If story like this one hit close to home, go ahead and subscribe. There's more where this came from. Because the thing about bullies, they are usually not as untouchable as they wanted you to believe.